Well, I'm Joan Domicelj, and I was a student of Lloyd's within the Faculty of Architecture in the late 50s, 1950s, and grew to love him like everybody else does, and was lucky enough to have him stay with us in Europe on his sabbatical trips. Lloyd, as a teacher, was a great relief to me in my first year, because at the time I did it, it was very formal training, and most of the other students had done technical drawing or something. I had done nothing like that. And so freehand art was a relief. And I have one particular vivid memory in an art class where I had created something truly horrible and was very depressed, and Lloyd came round and he stood there and he looked at it, and then he said, "Oh, look, that portion there, isn't that beautiful? Hasn't that worked well?" And I looked and thought, oh, maybe. And then he said, "And I think if you put a touch of white, the whole thing will lift." And then he went off, and it just gave me hope. I'd like to add also, for generations later, my daughter studied architecture also, and in the early 80s, and when she was in her first year, she wasn't supposed to be going to Lloyd's lectures. They were for the older students, and because she knew him from home and was very excited, wanted to hear it, she asked special permission, and she was allowed to attend. And she said that the first lecture she went to hear him, he had a standing ovation from the students. This happened after I'd graduated, because my final year was in 1960, and I think this was somewhere in 1962 or 4 or something. But there were, in the faculty, there were two professors, the Professor of Architecture and the Professor of Architectural Science. And there was a polarising of staff around those two figures and a mutual suspicion between them. And so when one was due for his sabbatical leave, he didn't want to leave the other one in charge for fear of what undermining might happen in his absence. They both felt like that. And so the outcome finally was that they both went on sabbatical at the same time, and they needed someone who everyone would trust. And who was that? The only person in the faculty that everyone trusted and loved was Lloyd. So Lloyd, from having been a part-time tutor, went to being Dean of the faculty for a whole year, and very successfully too. There's a big question about the influence of Lloyd, and I think you'll probably find that with all the people you interview. So, because Lloyd was both a very beloved man of great generosity and kindness, and somehow instilled that in the people around him, as well as a great artist with an eye that interpreted a philosophy in the landscapes that he was drawing or painting. And so both streams of influence were there. And my particular contact with him after university was really that we'd met at several of his exhibitions, and he'd got to know my family, my parents and so on. I went as a student, a postgrad student, to Edinburgh and met my husband there, and we had our first baby there, and that coincided with Lloyd's own sabbatical trip in 1966 and 67. So in 1966, when he had been in France and Italy and Greece and sketching all the time, of course, they came back to London and came and stayed with us in Edinburgh with all the sketchbooks, and we just had a gorgeous time with our immediate friends going through the sketches and so on. And then they went off to to Spain and Portugal and came back again and stayed with us. And as I mentioned, they got to know our closest friends, and Lloyd left a sketch as in the visitor's book of our professor and so on. So that was quite an intimate time. As an Australian citizen, I received from the embassy a weekly little newsletter of matters of interest for Australia. And once when Lloyd was staying with us, it arrived and it announced the changing brief for the interiors of the Opera House. And Lloyd was devastated. And he was so devastated that he actually wept in our living room. And I think that's important to know. I think the Opera House was a very significant process for him, both on the human and political side, but above all on the inspirational, creative expression that Utzon was capable of, and which Lloyd celebrated enormously. So that was Lloyd's disappointment about the change of the brief and the fear of what that might do to this superb design. But much later in the 1980s, so when Lloyd was already in his 80s, he told me once that when he tried to sleep as an old man with difficulty oversleeping, a bit of insomnia, instead of counting sheep, he tried in his mind to design his own opera house on Bennelong Point. And that was a sort of an exercise to get him to sleep. And then he said, "But you know, Joan, however hard I tried, night after night, I always came back to that design because Utzon got it just right." And of course he celebrated it by painting it over and over again, and so on. Well, I suppose having been fortunate to be introduced to Lloyd so early in my own working life or career, one of the things that comes from those early drawings, when you look through to the luminous, almost abstract paintings in his old age, is that the discipline of drawing, the skill, the craftsmanship is vital as a background to being able to loosen up and free. So I've come to the conclusion that going straight to loose and free is a mistake, that you need that discipline that Lloyd had. I can remember that Lloyd's generosity of spirit was with his time as well as everything else. So he had, in the times that I knew him, much later than the 1930s obviously, he had the discipline that he always worked in the morning, and so he didn't take phone calls or visits or anything in the morning, but in the afternoons he'd be available to whoever came along. And if the local primary school wanted him to open an exhibition of the children's work or something, he'd always say yes, but not in the mornings. And so I think that's an indication of the discipline that he just, when you see the copious work that he's done, a lot of that was actually discipline as well as self-expressions as well as interpretation. So I think that to me is one of the main lessons of how to do something really well. It's like an apprenticeship and you need to do that. And in Lloyd's case, of course, that early stages and the draftsmanship of itself produced beautiful things. So it's not that it was only leading to the later, perhaps more obviously spiritual work, but each step of his production, I think, was rich. I know that Lloyd loved Sydney. I know that because he talked about it all the time. And in that little film, The Magic Place, he was talking only about Sydney. So it's not at all surprising that he drew and drew and drew. And I remember him talking about Ball's Head and how when he first started drawing there it was so bare, but he went on loving that place. So he, it's a bit like what I was saying about the draftsmanship leading to the painting. He did enjoy getting to know a place more and more and more, and then interpreting it, possibly without looking at it at all. I think he was a political man as well, through his belief that beauty and good design improves the population's life. And so it was very important to him that the city should be rewarding for its citizens. And so he cared about crass development. He was upset about the North Sydney CBD's high-rise development when he thought it could have been something much more respecting of the topography and the harbour views and so on. He was, as I told you already, he was upset about the changes for the Opera House, but there were a number of other issues that he took up. And I'm particularly conscious of his generosity with Martin Place, because when it was decided to pedestrianise Martin Place, plans were produced which had a fountain and a waterfall and so on. The City Council was going ahead with it, but decided that they couldn't afford those frills, the water, and Lloyd had always thought that Sydney was a city that ought to have water throughout. And he was quite distressed at that. And so he organised a campaign for the waterfall to be retained. And he mortgaged his own house as the finance to start that funding program. And I've just discovered, because I'd forgotten all about it, that my own family was involved in that process. But that was where he really cared about what happened to the city, not only as something to draw or paint, but that he wanted its development to be rewarding for all the citizenry. So he had ideas, for instance, from possibly the 30s. He had the idea that there should be all new shops along George Street or Pitt Street ought to have awnings, arcades, so that people could walk along the arcade in shelter and looking in at the retail windows, and then there'd still be the strip beside it which would have trees and you could walk if you weren't looking at the shop. So he kept imagining ways to make the city even more beautiful. But I think he understood its bones so well that, you know, I mean, it is an extraordinary, it's a flooded river valley, Sydney, and with all that sandstone and eucalypts bring to that. So he had good reason to love it, I think, and the light. I think we could talk about the Lands Department building, because I had to give a talk recently on Heritage Public Talk at the Opera House, and I couldn't help mentioning Lloyd's view on that because of the proposed changes to the Lands Department and those old sandstone buildings which are yet again under some form of threat. And Lloyd understood something that is important to me in looking at the history of the evolution of the city, is that when you look at early buildings, it's their use as well as their fabric that gives them the character that tells their story. And so in the case of the Education Department building and the Lands Department, they've been government buildings forever until now, and it looks as if they will be commercialised. But the particular story I remember with Lloyd and the Lands Department is, I remember him telling me once, because he loved that, the design of the tower particularly. And of course it's disappeared a bit amongst high-rise buildings, but you can still see it, and he could still see it and appreciate it. And he said that he'd always seen it as some sort of focal point for the city, expressing the, I can't think of quite the words, but the Lands Department was what described the geography of the state. It held the maps, and it was a focal point physically, but also it had some story about the development of the area. And for him it was a landmark, an exquisite landmark. Lloyd explained to me once why he'd gone back to looking at prints and etchings and the technical side of those things. And it stemmed from the moment that Michael Parkinson interviewed him on television. And Lloyd said that that was a mixed blessing. It raised his profile enormously, but one of the outcomes was that there was suddenly a new market for his paintings of investors and people with a lot of money, and it was fashionable. And he found that very hard to deal with, because although it meant that he was earning more, it also meant that all his work, which he had felt was, if it was to be bought, it was to be bought by someone who really wanted to live with that painting or drawing. And he worried about people not being able to afford his work anymore. And so that's why he thought if he did prints, the price could still be kept at a reasonable level, and the people who were sharing in the landscapes that he portrayed would still be able to do it. And he was rather uncomfortable with the celebrity aspect of the interview. Yeah. And that's just part of his overall generosity. So I mentioned already the waterfall in Martin Place, so that was an act of generosity. But you already know that, for instance, to Sydney University, he was aware that, having drawn the Great Hall often, of the two empty niches on either side of the great doors into the hall. And so he sponsored Tom Bass as a friend who was a sculptor and who'd done the student thinker down at the other entrance to the university. He sponsored Tom Bass creating a male student in one and a female student in the other to complete the building. So that was, he sponsored the work of other artists a lot. He gave paintings that he had of other artists to galleries, and then he gave works to the Bathurst Gallery, which was Marjorie's family's area. He gave works to Tasmania, and as I said, he gave his time absolutely selflessly. He was a lovable man. Lloyd was gentle, but also actually quite forceful, and in the most delicate and diplomatic way, he could achieve his own ends. So one particular occasion, I and my family were at an exhibition which included a lot of his works, and there was a painting that finally I thought, for the very first time, I'm buying an oil painting of Lloyd's. I'm showing you one of my prized possessions, which is this painting, which is, I think it's Gerringong anyhow, Werry Beach area. And I was very excited to be able to buy it at one of Lloyd's exhibitions. And Lloyd, of course, was there. And he seemed pleased that I'd bought it. And he came and he put his arm around me and said, "Joan, I'm really pleased you've bought this. You and Serge have bought this. And you know what? I think I got the frame just right. And it's this frame." And of course, he realised that I might well have changed the frame. This is now a story that's, I think must have been in '76 or something like that. So it's a 40-year-old story and the frame's still there. And I must admit, if he hadn't said that, it might well not have been. So he was a very, not manipulative at all, but a very directional man. In 1983, my husband, Joan Domicelj, was director of the Sydney University Planning Research Centre, and they decided that it would be wonderful to record some key people talking about the city of Sydney. And of course, Lloyd was one of the first people they thought of. And so I had the great honour and joy of interviewing Lloyd about that subject. So a few of the things I've told you earlier probably come from all the conversations that went into that, about his visual enjoyment of the light and the physical forms, all that, but also his passionate concern for the well-being of the city as a city. And I remember we were in his house, of course, and you'll see in the film he's wearing a grubby old jacket, and the delight of going through the range of ways that an artist of that creativity could look at a place that was familiar to me and familiar to all of us, but to get a chance to see the issues through his eyes was fantastic.